Welcome to Close Your Eyes, Listen to Stories. Close your eyes, relax, and let me take you into the story. If you had walked the roads of France in the early 15th century, you would have found a kingdom that felt as though it were breathing through a wound. Fields still ripened, bells still rang from church towers, and sheep still moved like drifting clouds along the slopes. Yet almost every peaceful site stood beside ruin. Villages had been burned and rebuilt and burned again. Armies crossed the land as if it belonged to hunger itself. In one region, men swore loyalty to the French crown, in another to the English king, and in many places ordinary people trusted neither banner, because banners had a way of arriving with taxes, demands, and fear. In that torn country, near the borderland between Champagne and Lorraine, there stood a village called Domremy. It was small, tucked beside the Meuse River Valley, surrounded by orchards, meadows, and woods where children could gather berries and hear the wind move softly through ash and oak. This was the world Joan knew first. Not courts, not battlefields, not the bright violence of royal politics, but fields damp with dawn, spinning wool by the hearth, carrying water, tending animals, and listening to stories in a place where memory and prayer lived close together. She was born around 1412 to Jacques d'Arc and Isabelle Romee, peasant householders who were not wealthy, yet not destitute either. They held land, worked hard, and lived within the rhythms of village obligation, church feast days, and seasonal labor. Joan later said she learned from her mother to sew and to recite the Lord's Prayer, the Ave Maria, and the Creed. That detail is small, but it matters. Before the armor, before the banners, before the trial records turned her voice into history, there was a girl whose world was formed by sound. The low murmur of prayer, the crackle of firewood, the toll of bells from the parish church, the names of saints carried in sermons and processions. Medieval life was dense with the invisible. Heaven, hell, angels, relics, miracles, and judgment were not distant abstractions. They were part of the same moral landscape as the road to the next village or the grain drying in a loft. Domremy itself stood in a region vulnerable to raids, especially from soldiers allied with Burgundy, the powerful duchy that had turned against the Armagnac faction supporting the French Dauphin, Charles. Joan's childhood was not sheltered from the war. She later remembered hearing of armed bands and the suffering they brought. There were moments when villagers had to flee with their animals to a nearby fortified town. Imagine what such alarms do to a child. One day you are watching sunlight on a stream. The next, someone is shouting that riders have been seen. Doors slam. Hoofs strike mud. Mothers gather children with trembling hands. Yet the village also gave her something stronger than fear. It gave her a rootedness that never quite left her. People who met Joan later, whether they admired her or distrusted her, repeatedly noticed her simplicity of manner. She spoke plainly. She swore little. She attended Mass eagerly when she could. She liked confession. She had an intense sense of rightness and purpose that did not look polished or courtly. It looked provincial in the deepest sense of the word, grown from a local earth. That may help explain one of the great paradoxes of her life. How someone with no military education and no noble birth could stand before princes without seeming inwardly small. She did not compare herself to them on their terms. She came from another measure entirely. Around the age of 13, according to her testimony, something happened that divided her life into before and after. She said that at midday, in her father's garden, during summer, she heard a voice. At first it frightened her. Later she understood it as the voice of Saint Michael, And in time, she said St. Catherine and St. Margaret also came to her. Their messages were not vague comforts. They were commands, though they unfolded gradually. She must live well. She must remain chaste. And eventually, she must go to the aid of France. To modern ears, voices of saints may seem like either miracle or mystery, and in Joan's own lifetime, people argued fiercely over which. Some believed her touched by God. Some believed her deceived. Some suspected fraud, hysteria, or demonic influence. Yet if you want to understand Joan rather than simply judge her, it helps to pause in that garden and feel the texture of her world. She was not inventing a language foreign to her age. She was using its most serious language. The astonishing thing was not that she spoke of saints, but that she claimed those saints had given a peasant girl a mission that reached all the way to a king. The France into which that mission was spoken was near despair. King Charles VI had suffered long periods of mental illness. Rival factions had torn the realm apart. By the Treaty of Troyes in 1420, the French crown had effectively been promised to Henry V of England and his heirs, disinheriting the Dauphin Charles. Henry V and Charles VI both died in 1422, leaving an infant English king, Henry VI, claimed by English supporters as ruler of both kingdoms. Meanwhile, the Dauphin held only uncertain authority in the south. By the later 1420s, the English and their Burgundian allies pressed hard, and the siege of Orleans threatened to break the remaining heart of resistance. So while Joan moved through ordinary village tasks, history was gathering around her like storm clouds around a chapel spire. The rivers still ran. The sheep still grazed. The bells still called the faithful. But somewhere beyond the horizon, cities were starving, dynasties were collapsing, and a kingdom was waiting for a voice it did not know it would recognize when it came. For several years, Joan kept living in outwardly ordinary ways while the inward pressure of her calling deepened. That quiet interval is easy to hurry past, yet it may be one of the most revealing parts of her life. Great changes do not always begin with action. Sometimes they begin with repetition. A voice heard once can be doubted. A voice heard again and again, woven into prayer, fear, hope, and conscience, becomes a structure inside the mind. Joan said her voices came often, accompanied by a great brightness. They instructed her to be good, to go frequently to church, and finally to seek out the Dauphin. The goal was startlingly specific. She must help lift the siege of Orleans and bring Charles to Reims for consecration as king. Why Reims? Because in medieval France, coronation there carried immense symbolic force. The sacred oil of legend, the long line of anointed kings, the ceremony that wrapped political authority in holy meaning, all of it mattered deeply. To crown Charles at Reims was not merely to place a crown on his head. It was to answer a crisis of legitimacy with ritual, memory, and spectacle. Joan's mission, if accepted, would aim not only at military relief, but at repairing the imagination of the kingdom. Before anyone let her near princes or soldiers, she had to pass through lesser gates. She first sought help from Robert de Baudricourt, captain of Vaucouleurs, a nearby garrison town loyal to the Dauphin. According to later accounts, he dismissed her at first, perhaps with amusement, perhaps with irritation. Why should an armed commander listen to a teenage peasant girl claiming heavenly direction? It sounded impossible, and impossible things usually arrive wearing the clothes of embarrassment. But Joan persisted. Persistence was one of her least mystical and most decisive qualities. She did not drift toward destiny in a trance. She argued, returned, repeated herself, pressed her case, and refused to disappear. Sources suggest local support slowly gathered around her. Men such as Jean de Metz and Bertrand de Poulengy came to believe she might indeed have a divine mission. Whether they were convinced by her seriousness, her confidence, her prophetic air, or the desperate need for hope, we cannot perfectly know. Human belief is rarely pure. It is a braid of impression, desire, calculation, and wonder. There is a famous anecdote, difficult to verify in every detail, that Joan predicted a French defeat known as the Battle of the Herrings before news had widely arrived in Vaucouleurs. Some historians treat such stories cautiously, and they should. Still, the existence of the story tells you something important. Even before her greatest public acts, people were beginning to narrate her as someone who knew what others did not. Reputation formed around her not simply through doctrine, but through atmosphere. Eventually, Baudricourt relented. Joan cut her hair short in the style of a male page or soldier, donned male dress for the journey, and set out in February 1429 toward Chinon, where the Dauphin held court. The decision to wear male clothing would later become one of the most argued details of her life, both practical and symbolic. Practically, it offered protection on the road and in military company. Symbolically, it unsettled people because clothing was never just clothing in that society. Dress signaled order. To cross those lines was to invite scrutiny. Joan defended her choice as necessary, and in the conditions she traveled through, that defense was strong. Think of that ride across winter country. A teenage girl, not noble, not educated in letters, moving through dangerous territory with a small escort, carrying inside her the certainty that she had been sent to alter the fate of France. The road would have been cold, rutted, uncertain. In smoky, churches dim, rumors everywhere. If her conviction had been theatrical, it would likely have thinned under such strain. Instead, it seems to have sharpened. That is one reason even skeptics who reject the supernatural often still regard Joan as extraordinary. She possessed not a passing enthusiasm, but a coherent, durable conviction that translated into action under real pressure. When she arrived at Chinon, another story entered history, one hovering between documentation and legend. It is often said that the Dauphin disguised himself among his courtiers to test her, and that Joan picked him out at once. Whether the scene happened exactly as later retellings described, contemporaries did believe she made a powerful impression on Charles. She spoke with him privately. What she said in that private exchange was never fully revealed. Later rumor claimed she told him a secret known only to him and God, perhaps concerning his doubts about his own legitimacy. This is impossible to confirm. Its secrecy itself magnified the encounter. It suggested that Joan's authority came from access to an unseen realm that political maneuvering could neither control nor imitate. Even then, caution prevailed. She was sent to Poitiers to be examined by clerics and theologians. This was sensible. If a young woman claimed divine commission and asked to enter a war zone at the side of princes, churchmen would want to know whether she was orthodox, sane, and morally sound. The inquiry did not certify the truth of her visions in any modern investigative sense. Rather, it seems to have concluded that there was nothing obviously evil in her, and that given the desperate condition of the realm, the Dauphin might reasonably make use of her. One reported summary ran along these lines. Since she asks only for men, arms, and a chance to prove herself in Orleans, let her be sent. That cautious approval tells a tender truth about desperate times. People do not always need certainty before they act. Sometimes they need a door left open. Joan became that opening, not because everyone believed the same thing about her, but because enough people believed that hope itself had become a strategic necessity. And so the village girl from Domremy, who had once heard a voice in a garden, was given armor, a household, a banner, and a road that now led not toward Shinon, but toward the besieged city where her name would either dissolve into ridicule or blaze into history. By the spring of 1429, Orleans had been under English siege for months, and the mood around its fate was heavy with dread. The city sat on the Loire, a strategic key to central France. If it fell, the English advance might open the way deeper into the territories still loyal to the Dauphin. Yet Orleans was not sealed in a perfect ring. The siege was a complex network of fortifications, bastilles, and contested access points rather than an unbroken wall of enemy control. This matters because Joan did not arrive to perform magic over a hopeless ruin. She entered a hard military situation in which morale, timing, coordination, and aggressive action could matter enormously. Her real achievement becomes more impressive, not less, when seen this way. Joan traveled with a relief convoy carrying supplies. She had armor, probably white or brightly polished, and a banner that she valued even more than her sword. She later described that banner as showing Christ in judgment with angels, along with the fleur-de-lis and the words, Jesus Maria. The banner was not an ornament. It was a moving theology, a battlefield sermon in cloth. Joan said she loved it 40 times more than her sword. That phrase is revealing. Though remembered as a warrior maiden, she was not most deeply attached to killing. She was attached to sign, mission, and presence. Accounts from Orleans repeatedly emphasized the effect she had on people who saw her. Citizens crowded to glimpse her. Soldiers felt heartened. Clergy processed. The air around her was thick with expectancy, as though the city had become a stage on which prophecy might suddenly prove practical. She encouraged confession, prayer, and moral reform among the troops, and she sent messages urging the English to leave France. One surviving letter, probably drafted by clerks but reflecting her will, commanded them in sharp language to depart in God's name. Here was another paradox. Joan could sound both tenderly devout and startlingly severe. Mercy and judgment sat side by side in her speech. Military historians still debate the exact extent of her tactical influence, and honest storytelling should leave room for that. Experienced captains such as Jean d'Orleans, known as the Bastard of Orleans, and others played crucial roles in planning and combat. Joan was not a trained strategist who suddenly replaced seasoned commanders. But neither was she a mere mascot carried passively from scene to scene. She pressed for bold action when caution threatened to curdle into paralysis. She rode with the troops. She exposed herself to danger. She transformed morale, and morale in war is not decoration. It changes what people dare to do. During a series of assaults in early May, French forces attacked English fortifications around the city. Joan was present at key engagements, including the fight for the Tourelles on May 7th, one of the decisive actions of the campaign. Though she was wounded by an arrow or bolt in the shoulder or neck area, depending on the source. For a time she withdrew in pain, and the troops faltered. Then she returned with her banner. That return became one of the luminous images of her legend. Whether every detail later told about it is exact, the core is well grounded. She came back wounded, visibly determined, and the assault regained force. Picture the scene not as a clean, heroic painting, but as noise, smoke, ladders, shouting, mud, splintered wood, panic prayer. Men slipping from ramps into water, arrows hissing, armor growing heavy with sweat. And amid that, a young woman who believed with absolute intensity that she had been sent by God and that the hour demanded forward movement, not retreat. To many around her, that conviction looked like courage beyond nature. To her enemies, it may have looked like dangerous enchantment. To us, it looks like one of history's rare moments when belief, symbol, and event fuse so tightly that they can scarcely be separated. The next day, the English abandoned several positions, and the siege of Orleans was effectively lifted. The relief of the city electrified France. A military success had occurred, yes, but something larger had happened in the realm of meaning. Joan had done what she said she would do. In an age that read events symbolically, that mattered immensely, prophetic credibility now traveled with her. From there came the Loire campaign, a rapid sequence of French victories at places such as Jargeau, Meung-sur-Loire, Beaugency, and Patay. At Patay, in June 1429, the French defeated the English in a sharp engagement that reversed, at least for a time, the old terror of English field superiority. Joan was not a detached observer in this march of success. Witnesses describe her as active, energetic, devout, impatient with vice, and personally compassionate. She is said to have wept over the dead, including enemies. One chronicler records that she was distressed when French soldiers used coarse language. Another tradition says she tried to prevent camp followers from entering military company. Some details vary in reliability, yet together they reveal the consistent outline of her character: intense, disciplined, morally demanding, and emotionally permeable. It is worth remembering that she was only about 17. 17, in armor, advising nobles, riding among lances, sending letters to kings, and becoming a figure onto whom an entire fractured nation projected its longing to be saved from humiliation. That burden could have inflated a vain person into performance. Instead, Joan usually redirected glory upward. Again and again, she said victory belonged to God. Yet humility in her case did not mean softness of voice. She could be blunt with commanders and impatient with delay. She expected obedience because she believed the source of her commands stood above every earthly rank. After Orleans, the path before her was suddenly imaginable. The city had not simply been relieved. A spell of helplessness had been broken. The banner that had entered amid uncertainty now moved through triumph. And still Joan looked beyond the battlefield to the thing she had named from the beginning. The Dauphin must go to Reims. France, if it was to remember itself, must see its king anointed. The sword had opened the road, but it was the ceremony ahead, luminous and ancient, that would tell the kingdom whether this astonishing girl had truly come only to win a battle or to restore a crown. Victories can create as much anxiety as defeat, because once the impossible begins to happen, people must decide whether to follow it further. After Orleans and the Loire successes, Joan urged that Charles be taken to Reims for consecration without delay. This was not a simple proposal. Reims lay deep in territory that was uncertain, contested, or sympathetic to Burgundy. Courtiers worried about risk. Advisors hesitated. Money was short. Military momentum is one thing. A ceremonial march through unstable lands is another. Yet Joan understood something many cautious men did not. A crown doubted is weaker than an army tired. If Charles reached Reims and was anointed in the traditional manner, the psychological and political effect might outweigh a dozen lesser campaigns. Here again, her genius, if we may use that word, was not merely martial. It was symbolic. She grasped how legitimacy lives inside images, rituals, places, and stories that people already carry in their hearts. Medieval monarchy was not a modern bureaucracy draped in old habits. It was an embodied, sacred theater of authority. Reams mattered because memory mattered. Anointing mattered because sacramental imagination mattered. Joan, the unlettered peasant, saw with perfect clarity what many educated politicians obscured with prudence. So the royal army moved. Town after town opened its gates or offered submission with less resistance than fear had predicted. Auxerre negotiated. Troyes hesitated, then yielded. Chalons opened. The march had the feel of a tide turning, not only because soldiers were present, but because news traveled faster than cavalry. The Maid was coming. Orleans had been freed. English power had been checked. Doors that might once have barred themselves now listened for advantage, omen, and survival. One of the more touching details from this period concerns Joan's father, who had reportedly dreamed before her departure that she might go off with soldiers, a prospect that alarmed him deeply. Parents in every century understand that helplessness. To raise a child for village life, and then hear that she rides armed among princes and war captains, is to discover that history has reached into your own house. There is also a charming tradition, not securely documented but long repeated, that Joan wrote or sent word to reassure those from home. Whether exact or not, the image fits. She never entirely ceased to be the daughter of Domremy, even while cities surrendered at her approach. On July 17, 1429, in the cathedral at Reims, Charles was consecrated and became Charles VII in the fullest public sense available to his age. Joan stood nearby, bearing her banner. She later explained why the banner had earned the honor of being present. It had shared in the labor. That answer is beautiful and practical at once. She did not say it deserved pride. She said it had been there. It had endured danger. It had participated in the work. Imagine the cathedral interior, vast and shadowed, stone breathing coolness even in summer, candles trembling, clergy chanting, nobles ranked in colored garments and armor, the scent of wax, incense, and human closeness. Then the ritual acts, oil, oath, regalia, proclamation. Outside, bells. Inside, a kingdom trying to remember its own continuity. And there stands Joan, still barely more than a girl, who had declared months earlier that this would happen. According to witnesses, she knelt to Charles after the ceremony and embraced his legs, saying that God's pleasure had been done and that the king was now truly crowned. Some versions add tears. Tears are easy to romanticize, but in her case, they make sense. Reims was not only a public triumph, it was the completion of the clearest part of her mission. The voices had promised this, and now the promise stood in oil and gold before her. Its success did not sweep all tension away. In some ways, it sharpened it. Joan's sense of divine urgency remained fierce. Charles and his council were more cautious, more political, more willing to negotiate or delay. This difference would widen after Reims. Joan wanted continued pressure against the enemy. The court often preferred maneuver, compromise, or waiting. Here you begin to feel the tragedy hidden inside victory. A person formed for breakthrough is not always fitted for administration. A soul that speaks in certainties can become difficult in the slower weather of politics. During this period, Joan was ennobled along with her family, who were granted the name dark du lis in some records and traditions, though the exact forms of usage are complicated. What matters is the transformation in status. A peasant household from Domremy had been drawn into the orbit of royal favor. Yet social elevation did not dissolve the suspicion she inspired in others. Many admired her, but some envied, resented, or doubted her. Clerics and courtiers alike wondered what to make of a woman who crossed customary boundaries while claiming divine sanction. Admiration in public life rarely travels alone. It brings rivalry in its shadow. Joan also tried repeatedly to achieve peaceful surrender when possible. She wrote letters. She urged cities and enemies to yield rather than suffer bloodshed. This is an important counterweight to any crude image of her as simply a holy warrior hungry for combat. She believed war might be just, but she did not delight in slaughter. Her piety gave her severity, yes, but also a striking tenderness toward the suffering body. After Reims, Paris became a major objective, but the path there would be more difficult. The crown had been restored in symbol, yet the war itself was far from over. And perhaps that is always the way with human triumph. The bells ring, the banners lift, the old rite is fulfilled, and for one bright hour it seems that history has turned cleanly toward justice. Then dust settles, councils meet, alliances shift, wounds ache beneath armor. The miracle must now survive ordinary time. Joan had helped place a crown where doubt had sat. Soon she would learn that crowns, once secured, do not always remain loyal to the fire that won them. After Reims, the currents around Joan grew more difficult to read. She remained active in campaign, but the harmony between her urgency and royal policy weakened. An assault on Paris in September 1429 failed, and Joan was wounded there in the thigh by a crossbow bolt. The failure was not hers alone, nor did it erase what she had already accomplished, yet setbacks change how people speak. Success makes conviction look like prophecy. Delay makes the same conviction look inconvenient. The court increasingly moved through negotiation and caution, while Joan continued to believe that vigorous action was required. In the months that followed, her role became less clear. She still took the field. She still inspired loyalty. But she no longer moved through events with the same swift inevitability that had carried her to Orleans and Reims. By May 1430, she was in Compiègne, a town threatened by Burgundian forces. During a sortie on May 23rd, as fighting swirled outside the walls, Joan was pulled from her horse or otherwise overwhelmed and captured by Burgundian soldiers. That single moment changed the rest of her life. Capture in war was not unusual for nobles, who might be ransomed. Joan, however, was too politically and symbolically potent to be treated as a mere prisoner of rank. The Burgundians eventually sold her to the English and their allies. This transaction is one of the coldest facts in her story. A person who had become a sign of divine favor for one cause was turned into an object of legal and political dismantling by the other. If her victories had helped crown Charles, her destruction could help uncrown the meaning of those victories. She was taken to Rouen, held under harsh conditions, and guarded by men rather than nuns, despite her request for ecclesiastical imprisonment. This detail mattered greatly to her and later to those who defended her memory. The wearing of male clothing, which she resumed or retained in prison, likely had a practical function there as well, offering some protection in a hostile custodial environment where fastening garments could not be easily stripped away. Historians treat this point seriously, because it sheds light on choices later weaponized against her at trial. The trial that began in 1431 was nominally an ecclesiastical proceeding for heresy, overseen by Bishop Pierre Cauchon, a partisan of the Anglo-Burgundian cause. Yet it was inseparable from politics. The English needed more than her death. They needed her discredited. If Joan could be shown to have been a fraud, a heretic, or a servant of demons, then Charles's rise under her guidance would be tainted. The girl who had made kingship look holy had to be made to look corrupt. And here, in a chamber rather than on a battlefield, Joan performed one of the most astonishing feats of her life. She answered, hour after hour, question after question, before trained clerics, lawyers, and theologians. She answered with a poise that still startles readers of the transcript. She was illiterate in the formal sense, though intelligent and verbally quick. They were educated men armed with procedure. Yet she rarely sounds crushed. She sounds alert, wary, sometimes funny, often incisive. When asked whether she knew herself to be in God's grace, she gave one of the most famous replies in the history of religious examination. If I am not, may God place me there. If I am, may God keep me there. It was a brilliant answer, orthodox and evasive at once, refusing the trap without denying humility. Again and again she showed that her mind, though not schooled in university logic, was swift enough to sense danger in language. The judges pressed her on the voices, on saints' appearances, on her banner, on her clothing, on whether she submitted herself to the church. This last question was particularly dangerous, because in medieval theology, private revelation could not simply stand above ecclesiastical authority. Joan's answers were complex. She affirmed the church, yet distinguished between the church triumphant in heaven and the clergy questioning her on earth. She trusted God first. That distinction, however sincere, left space for her enemies to paint her as disobedient. There are many painful details in the trial record. She fell ill. She was threatened with torture, though not tortured according to surviving evidence. She lacked proper legal counsel. Notaries recorded and shaped the proceedings. She had moments of fatigue, fear, and inconsistency because she was human, 19 years old, imprisoned, and facing death. To admire her most truly is not to imagine her as unshakable stone. It is to see how much pressure a mortal frame can bear before it trembles. At one stage, she signed or marked an abjuration after being threatened with immediate execution, apparently agreeing to submit and perhaps to abandon male clothing. The exact form and content of what she understood in that moment remained debated. Soon after, she resumed male dress. Whether because guards left her no safe alternative, because her female garments were removed, because she reaffirmed the necessity of the clothing, or because she returned consciously to the sign of her mission, the act allowed the court to declare her relapsed. Relapse after abjuration was fatal. On May 30th, 1431, Joan was taken to the marketplace in Rouen and burned. Witnesses later describe her calling on Jesus. A Dominican friar, Martin Ladvenu, reported that she asked for a cross to hold before her eyes. An English soldier, moved or shaken, fashioned a small cross from a stick, according to later testimony. Another cross was brought from a church. These details have the tenderness of embers glowing inside atrocity. Even at the edge of execution, the story does not lose its human scale. A frightened young woman, clergy nearby, smoke rising, a crowd watching, a name spoken aloud for comfort. The executioners burned her body more than once, partly to prevent relic taking and partly to display that she was truly dead. Her ashes were cast into the Seine. This too was meant to erase. No shrine, no bone, no secret burial place where devotion could gather. Yet there are some lives that the removal of remains only enlarges. Joan had entered history by lifting a siege. She now entered memory by surviving an attempt not merely to kill her, but to explain her away. After Joan died, the war did not end at once, and the world did not suddenly agree about her. History is slower and less merciful than legend. Yet the meaning of her death began changing almost immediately. Some who had condemned her felt unease. Some who had watched her execution spoke of her courage. An English secretary is said to have lamented that they had burned a saint. Such recollections must be weighed carefully, but they endure because they carry a recognizable human truth. Violence meant to prove certainty often leaves doubt in the hearts of those who perform it. Charles VII, whose crown Joan had helped secure, did not rescue her during captivity. That fact has troubled generations, and it should. Politics, finance, military limits, and courtly caution may explain some of the silence, but explanation is not comfort. Joan gave everything for a king who could not or would not save her. There is no need to smooth that wound away. Part of her power as a historical figure lies in how clearly she reveals the difference between sacred vocation and royal gratitude. 25 years after her death, a nullification trial, often called the rehabilitation trial, reopened the case. Witnesses from Domremy, Orleans, and elsewhere spoke about her life, character, visions, conduct, and the irregularities of the first proceedings. In 1456, the earlier condemnation was annulled. She was declared innocent of the charges that had sent her to the stake. By then, of course, innocence could not restore a 19-year-old body, but it could restore meaning. It could say that law had been bent into a weapon, and that memory, though delayed, would answer. France itself changed around her legacy. The 100 Years' War eventually ended with French victory, and Joan became one of the figures through whom that national story could be told. Yet she has never belonged to only one story. She is at once a peasant daughter, a visionary, a military emblem, a martyr, a political problem, a saint, and a mirror into which each age has looked and seen something of itself. Monarchists admired her loyalty to crown and altar. Republicans later praised her as a daughter of the people. Devout Catholics honored her sanctity. Secular patriots claimed her courage. Artists remade her endlessly. There are also the legends, gentler and stranger, that gathered around her name. Some local traditions treasured the fairy tree near Domremy, a place associated with old folk customs and children's games. Hostile voices once used such memories to suggest superstition, while sympathetic tellings folded them into the enchantment of her youth. Folk legend. In some retellings, bells seemed especially dear to her because they echoed the cadence of her voices. In others, the wind over the fields of Lorraine is imagined as still carrying her prayer. These are not courtroom facts. They're the kind of tenderness communities make when history leaves them something too bright to hold by evidence alone. In 1920, Joan of Arc was canonized by the Roman Catholic Church. By then, 5 centuries had passed since the garden in Domremy, the road to Chinon, the banner at Orleans, the oil at Reims, the prison at Rouen. Canonization did not create her sanctity for believers. It formally recognized what devotion had long claimed. Yet the long interval is meaningful. Joan's life kept asking questions that no quick verdict could settle. What is courage when it comes in an unexpected body? What is obedience when earthly authorities themselves are fractured? How do we judge voices we ourselves cannot hear? And what happens when truth arrives and forms our institutions are least prepared to receive? If you set aside the banners and the bronze statues for a moment, perhaps the most moving image is still the simplest. A village girl standing in a garden, hearing something she believed she must obey. Not because obedience will make life easier, not because the path ahead is visible, but because to refuse would be to betray the deepest thing she knows. Whether one interprets that through faith, psychology, or history, the image retains its force. Human beings rarely live with that kind of undivided intention. Joan did, and it carried her farther than anyone around her could have guessed. And now, as the story softens, you can let the louder scenes recede. Let the smoke of battle drift upward and thin into sky. Let the cathedral bells fade into distance. Let the trial chamber close its heavy doors. Keep only the quieter textures. The orchard paths of Domremy after rain. A church lamp glowing before dawn. White banner cloth stirring in a wind that smells of river water and trampled grass. The murmur of prayers from lips too tired to speak loudly. The strange peace that sometimes comes when a life, however brief, has spent itself completely. Joan of Arc lived for only about 19 years. Yet within those years, she crossed the ordinary boundaries that her world set around birth, sex, rank, and power. She did not abolish those boundaries for everyone. History is rarely so generous, but she passed through them like a flame through dry reeds, showing that for a moment they could be crossed. That is part of why she remains vivid. She is not merely an example of victory because she died violently, not merely an example of innocence because she could be sharp, stubborn, and formidable, not merely an example of holiness because holiness in her case walked through mud, argument, fear, and pain. She remains because she was whole in a way that resists simplification. So when you leave her not in fire, but in light. A pale morning spreading over fields in eastern France. Frost silver on grass. The first bell sounding from a village church. A young girl pausing in the stillness, as if listening. And all around her, unseen by everyone else, the future waiting with its terrible crown, its wounds, and its radiance. And that's where this story comes to a rest. Close your eyes, carry this story with you, and slowly drift off to sleep. If you enjoyed it, subscribe to Close Your Eyes, Listen to Stories. There's always a new story waiting for you here. Sweet dreams.